According to the call guide of your directory, let's see. Guarding against fraud.
Wrong page.
Dum-dum.
Oh, here it is. If you need help in placing a call or have trouble dialing, dial O for operator. Please tell the operator if you're having difficulty placing a direct distance dialed call and if you heard any recorded announcements. The operator will be glad to help. With this in mind, Group Bell presents... Where's that jingle?
Why don't you try singing it?
A salute to your local operator.
Am I supposed to stand up and cheer?
The job of an operator requires much preparation as well as concentration. Before handling a call, she must prepare herself.
Operator.
Operators are very busy, and sometimes they have to rush from one customer to another, being very brief with each one.
Yeah. Probably working tomorrow morning. Operator. Ooh. Operator, one more. Operator, one more. Operator, oh. And that wasn't very good.
Due to these large volumes of calls, sometimes it takes quite a while for the operator to answer. But when she does, it's well worth it.
Any questions?
Did you ever get involved in phone phreaking?
I hate you. I got involved in phone phreaking on the very tail end of the 1970s, probably 1978, 79, 80, something like that. Got in a little bit of trouble for it. Went on to, and it's kind of funny because this is actually what piques my interest in this whole subject, right? I went on to do computer work, some computer security work later in life, but I always kind of felt like there was this whole story that I didn't know any of this stuff in 1978 or 79. I knew very little of it, but it kind of just stayed in my mind. I was like, wow, there's this whole story back there, and somebody really ought to do some research about it and figure it out. I didn't know at the time it was going to end up being me, but you know, I do think that there was all this interesting stuff there, kind of this precursor to hacking. And so in many ways I'm really glad that I ended up getting involved in that, because it really sort of sent me off in the various directions I went in my life. And I think all this time I had one of those brains that looked at things and wondered, well, how does that work? And it just made me curious. Yeah.
What, in the course of your research, did you ever run across any scenes or overseas of people phreaking on in Europe, South America?
Absolutely.
I came on board in '81, but you'd always hear stories on BBSs of, oh yeah, there's this great communist era phone system that was sold to Cuba, and you could dial into it.
Right.
There's all these stories, but there was no
The
no
last
evidence.
vulnerable switching machine somewhere in
Yeah,
the
it's just like, they don't even know what 3SS means.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. This was all over the place. It was definitely in Europe, and England in particular had a really fairly vibrant phone phreaking scene around from 1969 to, I talk about this a little bit in the book. From 1969 to about 1971 or 72, there were a bunch of kids at Oxford and Cambridge who were playing with this, and they ended up getting arrested and being criminally prosecuted. One of the things I love about this actually is, there's always this thing, to me, I love the curiosity of phone phreaking. Making free phone calls, is and was illegal, and that's not so cool. But these kids who got arrested in 1971, these college students, during the evidence during their trial, they said, okay, well, and this came out under cross-examination. So there was basically a bunch of these phone phreaks who were making these free phone calls during a tea party, because of course it's England, they have to have a tea party. And they're using like 10 different kinds of various colored boxes to make these calls and whatever. And it came out that, according to the prosecution's own evidence, there were 224 calls made during the course of this party. Of those 224 calls, 222 of them were made to non-working numbers that wouldn't have cost anybody money anyway. The 2 calls that were made that were actual real calls that would have cost money were paid for. So, you know, but this stuff was all over the place. It was in other countries besides England. And unfortunately, that will be volume 2. Or volume 2 will be about divorce. But yeah, it was there. So, yes.
How does the phone, if you do it from your phone, how does the phone company not know that these tones are still coming from your phone?
If you do it from your home phone, you're saying?
Yeah.
The main thing that essentially, if you think about how, not to go into the technical details, but basically the phone network wasn't set up to detect that, is what it really came down to. So it's sort of just due to the way they had architected it, because they never expected these tones would come from your home phone.
Oh, okay.
It just wasn't set up to detect that. So when they eventually did figure out that, well, yeah, the tones are coming, there is fraud going on, they would have to go to some amount of trouble and eventually end up basically putting a tape recorder on your home phone line to get evidence that you were doing that.
Traffic pattern analysis.
Yeah.
Too many 800 number calls.
If you made too many 800 number calls, or
They'll suspect you.
Or the other thing was people would call information, so call 555-1212, which was a free call. If you did that and then rerouted your call to somebody that wasn't a free call, right? You routed it to a different number, there would be a little tape made, it was actually literally a paper tape, and there'd be a little tick mark in the paper tape saying, okay, the number he called answered and we should start billing. Except that that's an anomaly, because a call to 555-1212 should never show up like an answer. And so then, engineers are looking at that saying, well, this isn't right, and then they start investigating.
So the law bell or whatever it was called thought these calls were coming from almost within the system as opposed to the home phone?
No, they knew it was coming from a home phone, but they had to figure out, then had to go to some amount of trouble to figure out which home phone it was coming from. So.
Also, a while back, as you know, the 555-1212 started souping, started going off the signal after a while. So, because then they started charging you for that.
Right.
That's the reason why.
Yes.
It seems like the story you tell is kind of the precursor to the internet age, computers, Apple computer, and all these things hacking. What was the precursor, in your opinion, to phone phreaking?
That's volume 3 after the the precursor to phone phreaking is really interesting. If you think of, I kind of think of phone phreaking at this point, as best I can tell, it's sort of the earliest network hacking that went on. The only thing I can think of that might predate it would be the telegraph system.
Ham radio.
But I'm specifically thinking of somebody hacking with someone else's system, right? So the hams were playing with their own system that they were building. I've read a little bit about the telegraph, and there were definitely, the telegraph operators have their own lingo and everything, and there was sort of a fraternity of them. I'm not aware of anybody who kind of, quote-unquote, hacked into the telegraph system. So I think this was kind of it. Definitely, though, the mental approach to this of wow, I wonder what we could do here. I think that's always existed. It's just that the phone system was the first automated network that allowed people to do that.
Cheshire Cat.
What about Cheshire?
Yeah, he did that. Telex.
Oh, he did telex. I'm talking about telegraph, though, right? I'm talking about with telegraph.
Oh, not Twix, though.
Yeah, not Twix. Yes.
How many people were actually prosecuted and did paid fines or went to jail?
I wish I had put that. I promised you I would only show you one chart, so I can't show you this chart, but you can come up and see it later. I have some data from AT&T that showed maybe during its peak, which is probably around 1976 or so, they were probably prosecuting about 200 people a year for this stuff. And it was, it kind of went from, basically nothing starting in 1970 to about nothing starting in 1980 with a peak at about 200 a year.
So what were they charged with exactly?
They were charged with fraud by wire, was the standard charge.
Title 18, Section 13.
Title 18. Exactly. John knows this. And so this is kind of an interesting story.
I had phone phreak classes with my father.
I talk about this in the book. So the phone company wanted to be able to use this fraud by wire statute, which basically says if you send, if essentially if you do something fraudulent over the phone that crosses state lines, that's a felony and a federal crime. And they actually went in the 1960s, they went to the Department of Justice and said, hey guys, how about this? Can we use that? And they actually talked to the guy who wrote the law. And he's like, no, that's not at all what we meant when we said fraud by wire. Fraud by wire is somebody calling up and selling bogus life insurance to grandma. That's fraud by wire, not these blue box things. Go away. So the phone company came back a year later and said, okay, well, we have a proposal for a new law. And the FBI and Justice Department said, so let us understand this. You guys messed up and made this network with all these holes in it, and then it's our problem to go and arrest people. No. So AT&T went off and came back again, and this time, because of this Green Star system, they had been able to find evidence of bookmakers, right, which the government did want. And they said, hey, we've got bookmakers for you to go after. And suddenly the government's like, wow, well maybe 18 U.S.C. 1343 would be applicable here. And sure enough it was. And it ended up actually going up all the way to the Supreme Court and said we're not going to review the decision. And so at that point, for AT&T, this was very cool because it meant by 1969 they actually had a clear court case that said, you know, we can use this law. And they proceeded to use it.
So were there other, out of this sort of huge sweep of and recording and analysis of phone calls, were there other collateral damage besides the bookkeeper? Were other parties out?
Yeah, hard to know exactly because AT&T was very, very careful about this. And actually, according to one of the guys I interviewed, their rule was if it ever looks like doing a prosecution will reveal this Green Star system, we're simply going to decline to prosecute. So what AT&T would do is when Green Star found something, they would call the local phone company and they would just tell the local phone company, hey, we have evidence that there may be irregular signaling was the term they used on this line. Would you please check this line? And so then the prosecution would occur at a lower level. And actually, I've got in the book I interviewed this guy, Bill Candy, who was their attorney, and he talked about how, yeah, it was always kind of stressful whenever you're doing any sort of prosecution based fundamentally on Green Star that like the defense ends up asking just the right questions and this whole thing is going to spill out. So.
Do you know how much money was stolen from
You can even say stolen without the airport.
borrowed?
It's a great question. I don't actually know. AT&T was estimating it at more than $1 million a year. But the problem is that AT&T had was, if you think about what a blue box does, it defeats their billing system, right? So once you've defeated the billing system, it becomes very difficult to know exactly how much there is. I think they certainly were going after, certainly hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe $1 million a year of actual prosecutions. Right? Other questions?
What were your favorite or most surprising FOIA results?
I think there were a bunch of them. The thing that really got me from the Freedom of Information Act request was just how seriously everybody took this stuff. One of them was there was a conference in 1976 at the FBI's Los Angeles office where it looked like the phone phreaks had been able to break into the military telephone system called Autobahn. And like the National Security Agency, which at that time was just ultra secret and hush-hush, actually sent a representative to this meeting. It took me 3 years to get this document from the NSA. And it's pretty cool because the NSA analyst was like writing up his trip report to LA. Hey, I went out to LA and attended this meeting. And he's like, speaking, I'm translating from kind of, staid NSA analyst speak, but it boiled down to, this stuff is pretty cool. We ought to try this. This is so
I can comment on the Autobahn system. I spent a whole year playing with it when I was up in Alaska. 907-940 is Nicholson Creek, 950 Murphy Dome. And these were switches that handled both Autobahn and commercial. And they were only just class marked. And if you get around the class mark, you can go into Autobahn, and from there you can use high priority calls and through NORAD and all that other stuff.
Yes, John. Other questions?
Yeah, along the same line, I'm wondering, you talk about people making free phone calls, but I'm sure it goes farther than that when breaking into the military system,
Right.
perhaps overhearing other phone calls. I mean, where did it go beyond simply making a free phone call?
Yeah, so beyond making a free phone call, one of the things which was kind of just a harmless thing was just being able to route your own calls around manually, either through the United States or through the world. So, make a call all the way to, say, New Zealand, and then bring it back to the phone next to you, and, say hello into the phone, and then get to hear it delayed for however long it takes to get there.
914052, the AT&T conference.
There were conference calls that Phone Phreaks set up. This is, again, now we probably all like, oh God, another conference call. Please don't put me on a conference call. But back then, this was a novel thing. So the Phone Phreaks would set up these big conference calls just to talk to each other. There was, as John mentioned, the Autobahn, the military network that was fun for the Phone Phreaks to break into. And then the final thing really was wiretapping. It turned out that with a blue box, you could, if you knew the right code, it was just a 3-digit code, it turned out to be 127. There were a bunch of numbers in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there were also some others in Miami and some in Texas, if I recall correctly, that you could wiretap with a blue box. And so you would simply call up a number in that area, you'd use your blue box, you'd dial keypulse 127, and then the phone number you wanted to wiretap would start, and you'd be connected to it. And it turns out that John Draper, John Draper actually did this.
It's actually scrambled, but you have to first the 2600 to knock the scrambler off.
Right.
But it only worked on the 252 exchange, and that was the exchange with the only, and that was the exchange
who was
that
in
the
that
FBI
exchange?
was at.
The FBI, exactly.
That exchange would work.
And so, like a moth to a flame, John wiretapped the FBI. They were not pleased. Phil.
What was the most surprising thing you learned while doing research for the book?
Two things.
Okay, what's most surprising things?
One was, I really actually didn't know very much about the history of the telephone system being built. And I mean, originally I had proposed to my editor, I'm going to write a book about the Phone Phreaks. And he's like, yeah, that's cool. Why don't you write a book about the Phone Phreaks and intertwine it with the development of the telephone network? I bet that would be interesting. He was totally right. At least to me, anyway, I found it interesting. But I was blown away by what AT&T and Phil Lapsley did building this nation's telephone network. It's amazing, right? They did all this stuff, again, with, with like the Star Trek term for it was with stone knives and bear skins, right? They're building these giant switching machines the size of this building, all so that you can make your phone calls, right? And developing digital computers and all this technology. So one thing I was just supremely impressed by how smart these guys were and how hard they worked at it. The other thing, though, was the early Phone Phreaks. You go back to 1961 or 62 or 63, these original Phone Phreaks, they didn't have other Phone Phreaks to talk to. They were operating entirely on their own. Often they didn't, it's pre-internet, so you can't just go and Google this stuff. And so you're figuring out all this stuff on your own, especially for some of the blind kids. They would just listen to these tones, and they'd be like, well, okay, maybe I can tape record the tone and then extend it out on tape so I can listen to it more, and then I can try and duplicate these tones. So they do all these crazy things, working entirely on their own, just because they were curious. And that was the thing that just blew me away, is how clever they were and how hard they worked at it. I guess at some level on both sides, right? How clever and how hard AT&T worked, and also how clever and how hard the early Phone Phreaks worked. I had no idea that it was going to be like that.
Was AT&T cooperative in terms of giving interviews and talking with you about the book?
Almost everybody was, almost everybody, period, both at AT&T and the Phone Phreaks and the FBI. AT&T actually opened up its corporate archives to me, which was really cool. I went away with these giant stacks of documents. The FBI did all these FOIA requests, and I think did a really good job. There were one or two people who, either on the Phone Phreak side, said, there was one Phone Phreak who I tried for weeks to get him to talk to me, and he wouldn't. And then one day at 6 a.m., I'm sleeping, Sunday morning, 6 a.m., my phone starts to ring, and it keeps ringing, and it won't stop ringing. It just rings and rings and rings. And so finally I get out of bed and I pick up the phone, and it's this guy, and he's like, yeah, I hear you've been trying to get a hold of me. I'm like, yeah, I have. It's kind of early. Well, I only have now to talk, so if you want to talk, let's talk now. Okay. So he said, well, before I talk to you, I have three conditions. One is you can't use my name. 2 is anything that you say involving me, I have to be able to review. And 3 is I get 10% of the royalties of the book. I said, I can't agree to that. He's like, too bad. Like, never heard from him again. So, but you know, there were a few people like that, but massively few. Most of them have to sleep at 6 a.m. Like that, but massively few. Most of them have to sleep at 6 a.m. Yes.
What happened to the AT&T tape recordings, the real reels?
These are the ones from the surveillance system.
Yeah.
So they were very good to hear them tell it. I have no reason to doubt that they basically, every time after they would be listened to, for the ones that did not show any sort of evidence of fraud, they would erase them. I suspect that the ones that did show evidence of fraud were either saved for prosecution. I don't know for sure. I do know that St. Louis Dispatch guy, Louis Rose, told me he actually had one that his source gave him when he blew the thing and blew the story. And he claimed it was in his storage locker. And I've never followed up. It would be a fascinating thing to hear.
So that's one. As a retired freak, one of the most interesting things these days is all the recordings that everybody made. You know, lots of different tape recorders, microcassettes, reel-to-reels, all running and recording their exploits and the things that they encountered along the way. So, do you have any interesting anecdotes along those lines?
I don't have, well, I have lots of anecdotes, but I won't. But one thing I was going to say is, yes, you should go to phonetrips.com. And so for those of you who don't know this, if you go to phonetrips.com, there is a lovely website that has these very recordings that you mentioned, and just everything. So you can hear sounds of the old network. Some of them are narrated, some of them are just pure. It did blow me away, though, like how many people I would talk to, including like telephone company security people, who have saved tapes. Like, so you guys, whatever your job is right now, save this stuff in case it's important later. Whatever you think is going to be really just mundane and boring, some guy like me is going to come to you 20 years from now and be like, did you work on this? Could you share with me? So, like, you know, in the case of some telephone company security people, they're like, oh yeah, here are tape recordings of interrogations I did of phone freaks. Oh, that's awesome. Or, you know, in the case of phone freaks, they'd be like, oh yeah, you know, I found this old 9-track tape that has recordings of us playing around with the telephone operator in New Zealand. You know, it's like, I don't know why you saved that, but I'm glad you did. So. Other questions?
Just one more, following up on that. How much that you wanted to see was lost to the 80s? Were there things you couldn't get?
Yeah, there were, and I think one of the biggest things was simply people. You know, I'm coming at this, you know, 40 years after its heyday, and there were a lot of people that I wanted to interview that had passed away, especially on the phone company, because they tended to be older than the, you know, 16-year-old kids. And that was, you know, in fact, actually, since starting this book, several people have passed away. It got to the point where some of the phone freaks were like, I don't want to talk to you, because the people you talk to you
Did you ever talk to George Alex in San Jose?
He passed away, sadly.
When?
Sometime in the 90s, well before I started the book. Really? So this was the telephone company security agent who used to hassle John.
Yes. In addition to this homebrew technical component in building blue boxes, there was always a really good, you know, social engineering element to it. Was there any particular social engineering stories that, over the years, that even, you know, you hear about exploits that just blew your mind, like somebody got away with it?
So for those who are not familiar with the term social engineering is basically pretending to be somebody that you're not and getting somebody to do something for you that they should not do.
I can tell you.
I've heard those stories, actually.
And yeah, there are a lot of stories. The thing that actually blew me away, though, about that was these things. And if they found, I was talking to another phone freak, this guy Bill Acker, and Bill's comment was, well, if the switchman seemed really good, he seemed really switched on and confident and knew what he was doing, you just play dumb. And you'd be like, well, I'm here at this such and such switching station, and I don't know how to do this. Could you tell me? People want to be helpful, so they tell him. And now he actually now has knowledge and has all the buzzwords. And so the next time, as Denny said, if you get a switchman who's kind of green, they're going to fall for whatever you say, right? And so wasn't really in particular like any one story. It was just the fact that they were willing to do this at all, right? I mean, imagine when you were 16 years old. You know,
like opening up sleeves to create conference.
They could create these conference calls, they do all sorts of stuff, and it's just imagine being that young and yet still being willing to, I'll try risking this. I'll call from my home phone and try and convince somebody who's an adult, who's, you know, actually a professional at what he or she is doing, and I'm going to convince them to do it. It seems crazy, but they did it and it worked.
Did you do any follow-up with any of these people that were phone freaks to find out in later life if they became successful and in that field or a related field?
That's a great question. Mostly, as near as I've been able to tell, most of the people I've talked to have done very well for themselves. Most of the phone freaks went on to have kind of what I would call conventional life. Right? A lot of them became engineers, a lot of them went into telecom, not all of them, and just went on. And this was their hobby. A few didn't, a few weren't so lucky, but mostly they did pretty well for themselves. One thing though, and this is interesting, the people, because I talk to all these people, right? And I'm mostly talking to them, say there's, 60s or 70s, they're close to retirement or they're retired. The happiest people uniformly, FBI agents. I don't know why, and I think it might just be that, like, if you're an FBI agent, you have to sort of be good at dealing with people anyway. But it's uniformly just a super happy, fun bunch of people to talk to. Not bitter about it.
Why do you suppose it took so long? Why do you suppose it took so long for someone to write this book?
Because nobody's as dumb as I am.
I mean, it's fascinating.
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think it took a tremendous amount of research. One of the things I've learned is that in the world of book publishing, long research projects are just not really economical to do, right? So you really, if you want to make book publishing economical, you need to be able to crank out a book every year. This book took me 5 years to do, so negative NPV, as we would have said this long. I think it's that, and I think it also kind of had to be the right person at the right time who had an interest in this and knew enough about it and was willing to make the energy and effort and had the loving support of my wife, who's just flown in from Bangalore, India.
Was there any other way that people tried to make money off of this? I mean, selling the boxes door to door or selling phone calls, but could they, call the bank and could they do something? I mean, was there any other?
There was a fear that people would do that. I never found any evidence that anybody, for example, wiretapping, right? One of the things you could potentially do is wiretap and then get information and sell it. I never found any evidence that anybody did that. And in fact, the people selling blue boxes were mostly frowned upon by the phone freaks because it was kind of this feeling of, you're just going to get us in trouble, right? And you're going to give these boxes, you're going to sell these boxes to people who don't know what they're doing, and that's going to create more and more problems. So,
Woz was selling them, right?
Woz was definitely selling them, yeah. He and Steve Jobs sold somewhere between 40 and 100 of these boxes.
I might add that his blue boxes put out a square wave instead of a sine wave. Anybody that used his blue boxes would almost certainly get busted. That was how I got busted. I wasn't using the blue box. One of my friends was, and he abused my trust, and his phone number was in his notebook. He told him to memorize it, and he didn't do it. And when he got busted, his name was Richard Cedar, a friend of Benny's, actually. He was the one that bought Woz's blue box. Got busted for using it at home.
Other questions?
So you've touched on this already, but I'm curious about, you've got this large group of people who are out there now, who are now able to make free phone calls. Mm-hmm. So who do they call? Was it mostly crank calls or calling each other? Or?
It's a great question. And it's so funny because you interview these kids, and uniformly their thing was, we didn't have anybody to call. But really though, so in the 1960s, the early 1960s, I think a lot of that was actually true. That you call non-working numbers, you see how close you can get to the North Pole. That was one game that they would play. But by 1968, when this network started to form, the phone freaks started using phone freaking to call each other, right? Because this is great. There aren't very many phone freaks, and so I live, in Northern California, and I want to call somebody in Southern California. I can't afford that if I'm a 15-year-old kid, but by using a blue box or something, now I can talk to my buddies. So a lot of it was kind of, self-generated traffic, if you will.
Well, calling test numbers too.
And call test numbers and things like that. But I think what the phone company was really mad at was the calls that actually cost money.
You ever heard of the term stacking the tandems?
Absolutely, that was another thing that you could do. You want to tell us about that?
Okay, stacking tandems are where you're able to successfully go from, let's say, from the United States to a country in Europe, and then from one country in Europe to another country in Europe, and then from that country back to the United States, and then back over to Asia, and then back to the United States again. There was a contest where we can loop, or make as many hops as possible and still be able to call the phone right next to you. So you have two lines at your house, and you start with one phone, and you go from the United States over like an overseas sender, which is 914-183, I think was one of them. And we go over to Europe and then call Britain, and then maybe to Spain, and maybe back up to Sweden, and back to the United States, and back over to Asia, and back.
Then you would hang up.
And you listen to all the stuff that
Prink, as each time.
But how did you know where it was going? How did you know that you were going
Doorbell. You spend a lot of time figuring this stuff out. And some of it also came from purloined manuals and things like that, traffic routing guides. There's a story I talk about in the book. One of the guys managed to get into an AT&T switching center by borrowing an employee badge because he had a friend who worked there. He basically went through the switching center looking at, well, what books on the shelves are books that I want? And then afterwards, he told his friend, okay, throw those away, and I'm going to be getting your trash tonight. And so his friend did that for him, so as a result, he got all these routing guides and things like that. And those things would quickly become, kind of photocopied and spread around phone trips.
WideWeb.com/phone trips. Classic tandem stacking by DoorDash.
Yeah, so
is a very good example.
If you want to hear what these ching 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 chings of tandem stacking sounds like, you can listen to that on phonetrips.com.
Or buy the Pink Floyd album.
Or buy the All right, any other questions?
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So now I'm just going to get rid of these chairs for you. If you'd like your book signed, if you please just line up along travel and give me.
Sometimes operators forget that the customer is even there.
Operator? Operator? You showed me that. Adorable. Adorable.
What number are you calling, please? Why is she what? Yeah. Huh? No, when I was saying to him, I don't understand you, he says, you don't understand me? Yeah, he may not. Him again, no. Anyway, back to my friend. She's working in the hospital. She had this young girl who has been in and out of the hospital for surgery half her life. She's spent half her life in the hospital. She, well, this is a noisy thing here. And she's in her 30s, and she's really a very intelligent girl. She's married. She has, I think she said, a child or two, something like that. So Betty said, something about, do you have something to read? And she said, I've never learned to read or write. And Betty said, so she was saying to me, it must be terrible spending half your life in the hospital and you can't even read. You got Mrs. Harris? So anyway, she says, well, give me the information about literacy volunteers and I'll give it to her. So I said, and so she, so she'll know what it's all about. And I said, how's she going to read it? Betty says, this is what I meant when I asked you, do you realize how difficult it is for people who speak the language but they can't read it? So, see, she hadn't even, it hadn't occurred to Betty that she couldn't read it after you'd given it to her, Yeah. Evidently she hasn't been able to go to school because she spent half her life in the hospital. But, I don't know why. There's just...
The operator is always kind and courteous.
Who are you kidding? If you need assistance, your operator will be glad to help.
What you want, dummy?
Operators are always enthusiastic about their job.
May I have the number you're calling? 514-791. Verify my number, please. I'm sorry.
But sometimes they get carried away.
Hello? 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 Hello?
Some operators are well aware of phone phreaks.
Sir, you are doing something with this phone. You have some sort of equipment.
Operators are always very friendly.
Bah humbug. Dial 654-9901 for verification.
Does that cost anything?
No, it does not.
It doesn't? I'll have the operator dial it anyway.
Well, then hang up and ask the operator to do it. I can do that. Hello?
Hello?
Operator?
Hello, operator.
Operator?
Operator, where are you located?
I am located in Suffolk County, Riverhead, Long Island.
Are you? Hello, operator.
Yes, I would like information, please. Operator?
I'm sorry, but you dialed it incorrectly. Please hang up and try again.
Hello?
Hello, sir.
Hello?
Where are you located?
None of your business.
Don't be so fresh.
Is this an MA7 number?
Hello, operator.
Is this an MA7 number?
Operator? Everybody is dialed incorrectly. Please hang up and try again.
Hello?
Hello, sir.
Hello?
Where are you located?
New York State.
You're where?
New York State.
We're in Hempstead. New York State, where?
Hempstead. You know, Martha has an office there.
Yes, I know Marbell has an office there. What is your number?
My number is 486-1212.
And under whose name is this telephone listed?
This telephone is listed under M. Bell. And the address, this is a 516 number, the address is 140 West Street, New York City, and I don't know my zip code.
You're giving me incorrect information, sir.
Operators are often very inquisitive.
How did you get me?
You're calling from a telephone?
Are you crazy? Are you playing on the phone? Are you dialing a number?
Operators are eager to get customers to make more calls.
Don't you have something else to do besides dial that number?
Operators are not the only ones who listen in on calls.
Teleprocessing Test Center. Are you servicing a 1050, 2740, or 41 type terminal?
No.
Are you servicing a BiSync device?
No.
I think normally it'll work for you.
Please say distinctly yes or no.
You've probably heard of an operator, but few people have heard of... Wait a second. Evan, look at that. Looks like there's an N in front of the O.
Well, actually, in this case, there should be an N in front of it.
IV5 6822 has been disconnected temporarily. At the customer's request, calls are being taken by 293-2830. If you need assistance, you may stay on the line, and an operator will answer.
Operator? 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 Operator?
An operator is always glad to cooperate with her supervisor.
Okay. There it is. Hello? I can't see. I've got my glasses. No. Okay. Service assistant? Yes. Service assistant, may I help you? No.
Each operator has their own style for answering calls.
Pussyfoots, huh? The number, I'm sorry, the number you're calling, you're having difficulty reaching it? For a letter. Station operator, what number did you dial? I don't want to talk now, okay? But I'll be blabbing to you, Linda. Station operator, may I have the number you dial? Oh, that doesn't mean anything.
Operators have a great sense of humor.
Number you dialing from?
My number is 5991000. Hello? Operator? Are you there?
But you want.
I'm sorry, your call did not go through. Will you please hang up and try again? This is a recording.
5166.
The telephone company doesn't take very kindly to customers helping out their operators.
In contact, but you don't know their number.
Hello, Kevin?
You've dialed incorrectly. Hang up and try again.
FBI.
You've dialed incorrectly. Hang up and try again.
We've got your number and your friend's number. I
Who
would
is-
suggest you hang up.
Who is this?
This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
It is?
It is. We will be in contact with you in the next 24 hours, Kevin.
Kevin?
So all in all, it can be said that operators are...
Hello, Kevin?
Open up.
This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Open up this door. Okay, break down the door to win. This has been a Group L production.
Why don't you make a record?
Thinking I was like maybe 40, 50 miles away from ground zero. Put my hands up like this to block the light, and I could see the bones in my hands. The EMP pulse took out the car immediately. My 6-transistor radio was switched off. It never worked. All the ignition wires in the car fried. There was a barbed wire fence, and there was smoke coming off the barbed wire fence caused by the EMP pulse.
Oh, yeah.
It was just amazing, and I can remember all that from back then. And you know how I can remember a lot of stuff? I listened to the radio, because back then, Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, and a lot of the old stuff from the surfing songs and stuff like that back in those days, you know? And I just listen to these oldies, and I just bring back those memories, and I'd sit there and I'd listen to the oldies while I'm writing, and then I can come back and conjure up all those things that I remember. And then if you listen to an oldies, you'll always say to yourself, oh, I remember when that song came out, and you start remembering all what you did at the time.
That's what
and
they said.
Just bring back all these memories, you know?